This audio is going to discuss a summary of Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of the first two chapters in Social Work 602. So, the first chapter talks about cultural diversity and implications for multicultural social work practice, which introduces the conceptual and physiological framework for understanding the meaning of multiculturalism, multicultural social work, and cultural competencies. It seeks to tackle hot bottom issues related to race, gender, sexual orientation, and other group markers. Moreover, it outlines how significant demographic changes in the workforce will impact social practices. In relation to voice, it provides a template and framework for the issues presented in the text that amplifies the emotional context of acknowledging and considering social demographic groupings. The textbook talks about four themes, which are cultural universality versus cultural relativism, the emotional consequences of race and or differences that inclusive. It also talks about exclusive nature of multiculturalism, the social political nature of social work practice, and the nature of cultural competence social work practice. The themes illustrates that the need for social workers to become culturally competent in order to validate and respect various racial, cultural worldview and perspectives. The framework for understanding the development of personal identity at individual groups and universal levels of human existence relate to race, gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, and so on. Unlike other texts in social work, it presents working definitions of cultural competence and multicultural social work practice. There are some suggested learning outcomes in relations to the Council on Social Work Education Policy Accreditation Standards, known as EPAS, Core Competencies, CSWE 2015. So in the chapter 1, the context in this chapter basically looks at competency 1, which demonstrates ethical and professional behaviors, competency 2, which is engaging diversity and differences in practice, and competency 3, which adheres to the advanced human rights and social and economics and environmental justice. In addition to these EPAS, there are learning objectives that states in the beginning of the chapter, which describes how the changing population demographics, which is the increase in individuals age 65 and older, increase in people of color, will impact social work practice. It also articulates how diversity of women's role and single parent roles will impact social work practice. The text also defines key terms such as multiculturalism, cultural competence, and multicultural social work practice. It also identifies how emotions relate to racism may impact one's ability to communicate with others. It lists some students' own culturally conditioned assumptions compared to individuals related to the inclusive and exclusive nature of multiculturalism. It describes social political ramifications of traditional social work practice. It also recognized the nature of cultural competent social work practice. It articulates how individuals, groups, universal levels influence personality. The text also explains how individual and universal bias, such as autonomy, independence, uniqueness, scientific slash rational inquiries, and negotiating of oppression and bias influences the social work practice. First of all, what is key is the race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class, disability, religion, and many other significant social demographic groups affects how individuals and groups perceive the world, as well as how individuals and groups perceive and understood by others, including social work. Second, a social worker must understand that such terms as cultural diversity, multicultural, and cross-culturals are inclusive in nature, encompassing both the multiple dimensions of human identity and the intersection of group identities. Finally, it's important to understand that we as cultural beings are composed of intersections of more than one social demographic group identity, and that some group identities may be more salient or may shift depending on the social context. Social workers must be vigilant to these identity shifts, unless they becomes guilty of stereotyping clients, perceiving them as unidimensional. Social workers must be constantly aware that all of us have an individual, group, and universal level of identity. As we go on to in the chapter, it talks about the framework for conceptualizing personal identity presented in the chapter that provides a model of understanding our individual uniqueness, our individual difference relating to race, gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, and so on. Similarities and differences related to our social group membership and our universal similarities. Failing to acknowledge all levels of person's identity is to potentially dismiss or disuse important dimensions of the person's fundamental nature of being. If you as a social worker have difficulties discomfort with acknowledging the group levels, for example, ask yourself why. It may tell you something about the bias and cultural bound assumptions about human behavior that you possess. The text provides the social work practice framework that will enable you to obtain greater awareness of yourself as a cultural being and to become effective multicultural social work practitioners. As we move into chapter 2 talks about social worker is a practice-based discipline. Thus, as professionals, it draws upon and is influenced by various disciplines, including sociology, political theory, psychology, anthropology, and philosophy. The theories and concepts of these disciplines are integrated to form an array of conceptual framework that becomes the theoretical underpinning for various models of social work practice. The chapter also discussed those major social work theoretical perspectives that not only inform general social work practice, but also have specific relevance to multicultural understanding of social work practice and intervention. In addition to commonly used perspectives such as strength, ecological, and social justice perspectives. There will be discussions of emerging postmodern and post-structuralism perspectives, including critical race and anti-oppression theories. Intersectional theory will provide a framework for understanding the complexity surrounding the diversity will be also presented. As we look at chapter 2, it suggested learning outcomes in relations to the Council on Social Work Educational Policies Accreditation Standards, EPAS, which is the core competencies. The chapter talks about competency 1 for chapter 2, which demonstrates ethical and professional behavior. Competency 2, which engage diversity and differences in practice. And chapter 3, which talks about advanced human rights and social, economics, and environmental justice. The chapter also discuss how social work practice, as with social work, is the Alliance mental health profession contained in both its process and goal, powerful culture, and social political dimensions. It discusses these dimensions presented are multicultural challenges to social workers as they interact with diverse and multicultural populations. One of the challenges results from a prevailing Euro-American Western value of individualism and autonomy that informs the culture of professional social work. Such value framework may contribute to a set of bias held by social workers towards those who cultural worldview differing from the prevailing worldview. Another challenge that may emerge from dominant cultural contexts are primary Euro-American of many of the public and private institutions that constitute an ecological space and network of diverse clients. Social work and human service agencies, organizations that are marked by oppression, marginalization, and alienation, correspondingly with these social identities may, in specific social contexts, are according to individual privilege, power, and acclaim. Recognizing the complexity of social work identities, social work education, and social work practitioners have incorporated an intersectional perspective as one's framework informing cultural competence such as social work practice. The preceding overview of these key social work perspectives provides a foundation for understanding cultural competence and core to social work practice. One of the authors in the text has heard on more than one occasion a version of assertion that developing cultural competence social work practice is ancillary to traditional social work practice. Implicit in the statement is the notion that there is distinction between traditional, clinical-oriented social work practices and cultural competent social work practice. The chapter also talks about the position takes in the text is cultural competent social work practice is not ancillary to social work, but supportive of social work principles of pursuing and advocating for social justice. In the chapter, it attempts to demonstrate a point that will also be made in subsequent chapters, that perspectives that inform developing competence in social work practice are perspectives that are important to the development of multicultural competence, and social work practice. So that's going to end chapter 1 and 2 of the lecture. For the chapters, I recommend that you read each chapter and you also look at the core competency for each of the chapters and have an understanding of what it involves and how it fits into the assignment process. If you have any questions about chapter 1 or 2, feel free to contact me by cell. My number is area code 843-345-2224. That ends my recording for chapter 1 and chapter 2.